I am absolutely delighted to be able to introduce this session. I have not seen Oliver for yonks. We were fellow students in Princeton grad school and played table tennis regularly. It's interesting that Oliver Hart's work is, of course, well known and earned him very deservedly the Nobel Prize. Currently, he's extended this work on how to do better contracts and develop social responsibility, and he will be in discussion with Colin Mayer, and both Colin and I are looking at the other side of the coin. Contracts are external mechanisms to induce firms towards social responsibility. And the last book by Colin, Prosperity, and the book that is going to come out soon on crises looks at moral responsibility. And my work is also concerned with psychological motivation and moral motivation. And therefore, I really look forward to this discussion and welcome Colin to the stage.
Thank you very much, Dennis. And Oliver, it's a great pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you. You've recently written with your co-author, Luigi Zingalis, some papers which suggest that we need a new model in the 21st century of corporate governance. What's wrong with the existing model?
Well, I think, first of all, hello, Colin. Also, hello, Dennis. Good to see you after all these years. I think what's wrong with the existing model is that it's assumed that A, companies should act on behalf of their owners, shareholders. That's something actually Luigi and I agree with, but that's the first thing. But the second thing is that what these shareholders want is the companies they own to make as much money as possible, to make the shareholders as wealthy as possible. We disagree with that. That's what we think is wrong, that it's assumed that the shareholders of companies, and remember the ultimate shareholders are people like you and me, and we're not just interested in money. In our personal lives, we make trade-offs. We sometimes give up some money to do something morally responsible. And why wouldn't we want the companies we own to do the same thing? That's the basic position that Luigi and I are taking, that shareholders' preferences are more complicated than what is typically assumed.
And what then are you suggesting should be done about this?
Well, what we're suggesting, we're really sort of saying we should have more shareholder democracy, that companies need to listen to their shareholders, actually need to find out what their shareholders want. Whether they're willing to give up a bit of money in order to avoid some social harm. That's something companies could try to learn about. And the same is true of asset managers, who also have taken traditionally, and still now take the view that when they are engaging with companies, when they are voting, when they're involved in shareholder resolutions, that they should vote in a way that maximizes long-run financial return. Well, actually, the people they represent may sometimes not want them to do that. So asset managers need to also find out about the social preferences of their investors.
So you don't think that they're doing this at the moment? Well, what can be done to encourage them to do more of that?
Well, there are various possibilities. One possibility is, and this would be getting asset managers out of the voting business. One possibility is to push shareholder voting down to the retail shareholders, to actually have them do the voting themselves. We're talking about people who are invested in mutual funds where currently the asset manager would do the voting. So one possibility is to have the retail shareholders do the voting, and a second possibility would be for the asset managers, instead of delegating the voting, they would continue to do the voting, but they would find out what kind of preferences their shareholders have, and aggregate those in some way to do the voting at the fund level.
And do you think that that would really address the environmental and social issues that we're currently confronting?
Well, I think it could help to address them. I guess, if I'm in favor of shareholder democracy, so what that means is finding out what the shareholders want. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll always want what I think they should want. So, sometimes we might find that the majority is very conservative and wants a conservative small c, maybe is the right way to think of it, and wants to just push for a higher financial return. And, let's not worry about the carbon footprint or something else. We might find that, but we might find the opposite. Just as in politics, democracy doesn't always work the way any particular individual would like.
But given what's going on in the US in particular in terms of the attacks on woke capitalism, don't you think that there's a real risk that this could actually end up with the environment being destroyed more and inclusion of people being actually diminished? Don't you worry about that?
Well, first of all, the attacks on woke capitalism are happening because the asset managers have so much voting power. This is, I think, the problem, that the right attacks, Larry Fink for being too woke. The left would be inclined to attack him for not being woke enough. This is because he's doing the voting. If, in fact, voting was either delegated to the ultimate investors, or, as I say, or someone like Larry Fink actually found out what they wanted and voted that way, then he would no longer be the subject of attacks. He could just say, well, it's not my it's not my preferences here, it's those of the people I'm representing. It's hard for me. So that's the first thing. I think this would be a way to get out of what we're seeing now in the US. Is there evidence that it would push things in a worse direction? I'm not, there are some people trying to do that. There's, Vivek Ramaswamy, who's a presidential candidate, has set up this Strive Fund, which is pushing companies to be more Friedmanite and just focus on the bottom line. But I don't get the sense that he's representing the majority, but who knows?
And in terms of the extent to which you think that this is something that's really going to be politically feasible in the near future, are there any other policies that you'd like to see being undertaken that would reinforce what you're trying to achieve?
Well, first of all, let me make it clear. I don't think that a shareholder democracy movement is going to solve the world's problems. I'm like most economists, think when there are big externalities, we need the government involved. The trouble is that it's very difficult to get governments to do the right thing these days, at least in my opinion, particularly when the problems are international. You need coordination by many governments. In situations like that, companies, particularly maybe multinational companies, can actually help. But it's not going to, that doesn't mean that we don't need governments to do a lot of stuff as well. We definitely do. But let me just say that particularly, sometimes the problems we're talking about are not, may involve a particular company and something bad that company is doing, which is not something that maybe policymakers would be focused on because it may be too small for them. But the shareholders, in contrast, could actually be a very positive force there. So that's one thing I would like to say. The second thing is, I don't know whether we're going to get to practicalities, but I think one thing I would like to note, and I think it's partially an answer to your question, Colin, is, you know, when I suggest to people, or when people talk about pushing voting down to the shareholder level, to the retail shareholder level, of course, what's often, you know, you hear back is, well, this is just not feasible, because how could shareholders you know, spend all their time voting? I mean, they, you know, if they have an index fund, we're talking about thousands of companies, and they can't keep track of all the proxy statements. But there is a solution to that. I think this is where modern technology can be very helpful. I'll just mention one service that exists by a company called Iconic, where they ask you questions about your preferences. And, you know, it took me about 10 or 15 minutes to fill out the questionnaire. And then they will vote on your behalf. So it's sort of an algorithm that will now do the voting for you. So this is a sort of thing that I think there's going to be more of that, which is actually going to make this approach more feasible.
And do you see any of the large mutual funds, the Blackrocks, the Vanguards, are they doing any of this?
I think, Iconic has linked up with one fund. It's not one of the bigger ones, though. And I think they also have a partnership now with As You Sow. That's, of course, not a mutual fund. So I think they're just beginning. They only started literally a few weeks ago, maybe a month or two. But, you know, so it's very early days. But I can certainly imagine big asset managers wanting to offer this service to their own clients. I'm hoping that's going to happen.
And what about the regulators? What are organizations like the SEC doing about this?
About that, I don't know. I mean, obviously one thing that's going to be important is to make sure that anybody offering a service like that is indeed voting the right, you know, is not is following your preferences. In the case of Iconic, I can see how they voted for me, but of course, am I going to keep track of it? Probably not. So I can see some role for regulation there, but I'm not aware that the SEC is you know, yet doing anything about that. But I may be wrong.
And just to be clear, you're not advocating what is sometimes termed stakeholder capitalism, and that is to broaden the participation beyond shareholders. Is that correct?
That's basically correct. What I'm saying is, or Luigi and I are saying, is that to the extent that the shareholders may be concerned about stakeholders, then of course, you know, getting shareholder preference, it's going to bring in stakeholders. But I'm, you know, reluctant to give stakeholders a formal voice through votes, simply because that's not the way most companies are set up. You can set up a company to give stakeholders representation if you want, and some companies are set up that way, but most companies are not. So for me, that's just tricky to go that extra step.
And if we came back, Oliver, as one final question, in 10 years' time, and we had a similar conversation, what one thing would you like to have seen happening in the intervening period to demonstrate that the world has really gone in the right direction?
Well, I'll come back to what I said at the beginning. Either shareholders just being their voices being heard more, and it's, you know, no longer being assumed that they're only interested in money. I mean, it may turn out they are. If they are, okay. If that's what the majority wants, so be it. But I would like, at least in 10 years' time, I would like it to be the case that they've had a chance to express their views.
Professor Oliver Hart, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Philip.